Hey there, garden friends. Welcome back to Botanic Haven, your go-to spot for everything gardening, plant care, and creating those beautiful green spaces both inside your home and out in your yard. I'm so glad you're here today because we're diving into something that literally changed my entire approach to growing grapes, and I know it's going to help you too. We're talking about pruning, specifically that one cut that most people get completely wrong, and once you fix it, your grapevines will absolutely explode with growth and fruit. Trust me, I've been there, made all the mistakes, and I'm here to save you years of frustration and mediocre harvests. So let me start with a little story. A few years back, I was visiting my neighbour Oliver, who'd been growing grapes for about 15 years. His backyard looked like something out of a vineyard catalogue. These gorgeous, thick vines laden with beautiful clusters of grapes, deep purple and green varieties just hanging there like nature's candy. Meanwhile, my grapevines looked sad, skinny with maybe a handful of grapes if I was lucky. I was pruning them every year, following what I thought was solid advice from various gardening books and videos, but something just wasn't clicking. Oliver noticed my frustration one afternoon when I was complaining about my pathetic harvest, and he laughed, not in a mean way, but in that knowing way that says he'd been exactly where I was. He told me to bring my pruning shears over the next weekend, and he'd show me what I was doing wrong. That weekend changed everything. Oliver walked me through his vines, explaining the anatomy of grape growth in a way that finally made sense. See, most people, myself included back then, approach grape pruning with this mindset of just cutting back whatever looks overgrown or messy. We trim here and there, try to shape the vine into something aesthetically pleasing. Maybe cut off some of the woody, older growth, thinking we're helping the plant focus its energy. But here's the thing that blew my mind. Grapevines don't work like most other plants. They fruit on new wood that grows from one-year-old canes. If you don't understand that basic principle, you'll be cutting off next year's entire harvest without even realizing it. Oliver pointed to his vines and showed me the difference between old wood, one-year-old canes, and the new shoots that would emerge in spring. The one-year-old canes were slightly lighter in color, more flexible with visible buds along their length. Those buds, he explained, were where all the magic would happen. The critical mistake I was making, and the one I see constantly in backyard gardens, is leaving too many canes or cutting the wrong ones entirely. I'd leave these long, sprawling canes thinking more wood meant more grapes, or I'd trim everything back to keep the vine compact and manageable. Both approaches were sabotaging my harvest. Grapevines need a specific balance. Too many canes and the plant spreads its energy too thin, producing lots of small, underwhelming grape clusters. Too few canes or cutting the wrong ones, and you're literally removing your fruiting wood before it ever gets a chance to produce. The secret, the one cut that makes all the difference, is identifying and keeping the right number of healthy, one-year-old canes while ruthlessly removing everything else. It sounds simple, but the execution requires understanding what you're looking at. Let me break this down in a way that's actually useful. When you look at your grapevine in late winter or early spring, before the buds start swelling, you'll see a mix of different types of growth. There's the main trunk, thick and woody, which is your permanent structure. Then there are older canes from previous years, darker and more rigid. Mixed in are the one-year-old canes, which grew during the last growing season. These are your golden ticket. They're pencil-thick or slightly larger, relatively smooth, lighter brown than the older wood, and they'll have buds spaced along their length every few inches. When you prune, your goal is to select 4 to 6 of these healthy one-year-old canes, depending on your vine's vigor and your training system, and remove absolutely everything else. That's the cut. That's the difference between a vine that produces moderately and one that produces abundantly. Now, I know what you're thinking because I thought the same thing. If I cut away that much of the plant, won't I be hurting it? Won't it take forever to recover? The answer is no, and here's why. Grapevines are incredibly vigorous plants. They want to grow. In the wild, they'd sprawl all over the place, climbing trees and covering entire hillsides. By pruning heavily and strategically, you're not weakening the plant. You're directing its considerable energy into productive growth rather than unproductive sprawl. Each bud on those canes you keep will push out new shoots in spring, and those shoots are what will carry your grape clusters. By limiting the number of canes, you ensure each shoot gets enough nutrients and sunlight to produce large, healthy bunches of grapes. It's counterintuitive, but it works beautifully. If this guide has helped you, write 1 in the comments, and if not, write 0. This way, I'll know which tips are most useful for your garden. I really do read through those comments, and it helps me understand what you all need to hear more about. But let's keep going because there's so much more to cover about getting this right. One thing Oliver emphasized, and something I now preach to anyone who'll listen, is that the quality of the cane matters just as much as which type of cane you're keeping. You want canes that grew vigorously last season, meaning they're thick, healthy, with tight bud spacing and no signs of disease or damage. Weak, spindly canes won't produce well even if they're the right age. Same with canes that have wide spacing between buds, those tend to produce less fruit. When you're selecting your keepers, look for the best specimens. Run your hand along the cane and feel for firmness and vitality. Check for any dark spots, lesions, or areas that look dried out or damaged. Those should be eliminated. You're essentially choosing the strongest candidates to carry your crop, so be picky. Another crucial aspect is where you make your cuts. This isn't just about which canes to keep, but how you cut them. When you remove a cane completely, cut it back to the main trunk or to a main branch, making the cut close but not flush. Leave just a tiny stub, maybe a 1/4 inch, which allows the vine to heal properly without leaving a large wound that could invite disease. When you're shortening a cane that you're keeping, count the buds and cut just beyond the bud you want to be the terminal one. Most training systems call for canes with 8 to 12 buds, though this varies. Make your cut at a slight angle, about 1/2 inch beyond the last bud you want to keep, angling away from the bud so water doesn't collect there. Sharp, clean tools are essential. Dull pruners crush the wood rather than cutting cleanly, which creates more damage and slower healing. I learned this the hard way when I used my old beat-up shears and ended up with several canes that got infections at the cut sites. Let me tell you about my friend Daisy, who grew up helping her grandmother tend a small vineyard in their backyard. She learned pruning as a kid, watching her grandmother's hands move confidently through the vines every late winter. But here's the interesting part. When Daisy moved across the country and started her own grape plants, she struggled for the first few years because she'd never actually understood the why behind what her grandmother did. She was mimicking the motions but didn't grasp the principles. Her grandmother had made it look easy, almost meditative, just walking along and snipping here and there. What Daisy didn't realize was that her grandmother was making split-second decisions based on decades of experience, reading each vine individually and adjusting her cuts accordingly. Once Daisy took the time to really study grapevine physiology and understand the reasoning behind each cut, her skills improved dramatically. Now she's got a beautiful arbor covered in thriving grapevines that produce more fruit than she can eat. The timing of your pruning is another element that can make or break your success. The ideal window is late winter to very early spring, when the vine is still dormant but before the buds start to swell and the sap begins rising. In most climates, this means sometime between January and March, depending on your location. Pruning too early, like in fall or early winter, can leave the cuts vulnerable to harsh cold and damage the vine. Pruning too late, after the sap is flowing, leads to bleeding where the cuts weep sap, which weakens the plant and can attract pests. I made the mistake of pruning in early April one year, thinking I was still within the safe window, and my vines dripped sap for weeks. They survived, but their growth was noticeably weaker that season, and the harvest was disappointing. Here's something that surprised me when I first learned about it: the concept of renewal spurs. When you're setting up your pruning system, you don't just want to think about this year's crop. You need to plan for next year too. That means when you select your 4 to 6 fruiting canes, you also want to leave a couple of short spurs near the base of each cane, cut back to just 2 or 3 buds. These renewal spurs won't produce much fruit this year, but they'll send out new shoots that will become next year's fruiting canes. This creates a sustainable cycle where you're constantly renewing your fruiting wood without letting the vine get away from you. It's like planning crop rotation, but on a single plant. The first year I implemented this, I felt like I'd unlocked some secret level of grape growing. My yields became consistent year after year instead of the boom and bust cycle I'd experienced before. Different grape varieties and training systems require slight modifications to the basic principle, but the core idea remains the same. Whether you're growing table grapes, wine grapes, or those gorgeous ornamental varieties, whether you're using a trellis, arbor, pergola, or fence, the fundamental rule is to prune back to a limited number of one-year-old canes and remove the rest. Some training systems, like the 4-arm Niffin, call for 4 main canes arranged in 2 tiers on a wire trellis. Others, like the Geneva double curtain, use a different configuration. But regardless of the system, you're always making that critical decision about which canes stay and which go. Once I understood this, I could adapt my pruning to any setup and get great results. Let's talk about what happens after you make your cuts, because the work doesn't end there. Once you've pruned your vines, take a good look at your training structure. Make sure your wires or supports are in good condition, tighten anything that's gotten loose, and plan how you'll tie the canes you kept. Those canes need to be secured to your support system in a way that spreads them out and exposes them to sunlight. I use soft garden ties or even strips of old t-shirts, anything that won't cut into the vine as it grows. The goal is to create a framework where the new shoots that emerge from those buds have room to grow without crowding each other. Crowded shoots mean poor air circulation, which invites fungal diseases, and shaded fruit, which doesn't ripen well. Feeding your vines after pruning gives them the energy they need to push out vigorous new growth. I like to apply a balanced fertilizer or some well-aged compost around the base of each vine in early spring, just as the buds are starting to swell. Grapevines aren't particularly heavy feeders compared to some fruiting plants, but they do appreciate a nutrient boost at the start of the growing season. Too much nitrogen, though, and you'll get lots of leafy growth at the expense of fruit, so keep it moderate. A soil test can tell you exactly what your vines need, but if that feels like overkill, a general-purpose organic fertilizer applied according to package directions works well for most situations. One of the most rewarding things about proper grape pruning is watching the transformation unfold. After you've made your cuts and spring arrives, those buds on your carefully selected canes will start to break, sending out bright green shoots. Within weeks, you'll see tiny grape clusters forming along those shoots, and you'll realize that every single cluster is positioned where it can get light and air. Compare that to an unpruned or poorly pruned vine where shoots emerge in a tangled mess, clusters hidden in shade, and the whole plant looks chaotic. The difference is night and day, and it all comes down to that one concept: keeping the right canes and removing everything else. I remember talking to a woman named Rose at a gardening workshop who was convinced her grapevines were just bad stock. She'd bought them from a reputable nursery, planted them in good soil, watered them faithfully, but after 4 years she was getting maybe a handful of grapes per vine. She was ready to rip them out and plant something else. During the workshop, she described how she'd been pruning them, and it became immediately clear that she was cutting off all the one-year-old wood and leaving only the old, thick canes, thinking those were the strong, established parts that would produce fruit. She had it completely backward. When I explained the concept to her and she understood what she'd been doing wrong, you could see the light bulb go on. She went home, waited for the right season, pruned her vines correctly, and sent me photos the following fall of absolutely gorgeous grape clusters, more than she'd ever imagined possible. Her vines weren't bad stock at all, they just needed the right pruning approach. Let's address some common mistakes beyond just selecting the wrong canes, because there are several ways people sabotage their grape harvest. One big one is leaving too much fruit. Even with perfect pruning, if you let every single cluster stay on the vine, you'll end up with quantity over quality. Thinning grape clusters early in the season, removing some of the smaller or poorly positioned ones, allows the remaining clusters to develop fully with larger, sweeter grapes. I know it feels wasteful to cut off potential fruit, but trust me, the difference in quality is worth it. Another mistake is neglecting summer pruning. While winter pruning sets up your framework, summer pruning manages the growth throughout the season. This means pinching back overly vigorous shoots, removing suckers that pop up from the base or trunk, and keeping the canopy open so light reaches the fruit. I do a quick pass through my vines every couple of weeks during the growing season, and it only takes a few minutes per plant. Pest and disease management ties directly into pruning practices too. A well-pruned vine with good air circulation is much less susceptible to powdery mildew, downy mildew, and bunch rot. all of which thrive in humid, crowded conditions. By keeping your vine open and properly structured, you're creating an environment where leaves and fruit can dry quickly after rain or irrigation, which drastically reduces disease pressure. I used to battle powdery mildew every summer until I got serious about proper pruning and canopy management. Now I rarely see it, and when I do, it's minimal and easy to control with organic sulfur sprays. Water management is another piece of the puzzle. Grapevines are remarkably drought-tolerant once established, but they do need consistent moisture during critical periods, particularly when the fruit is developing. However, they don't like wet feet, so good drainage is essential. In my garden, I found that deep, infrequent watering works much better than frequent, shallow watering. This encourages the roots to grow deep, making the plant more resilient during dry spells. I water my vines deeply once a week during the growing season if we haven't had rain, and I mulch around the base to help retain moisture and suppress weeds. The mulch also breaks down over time, adding organic matter to the soil. There's a meditative quality to pruning grapevines once you understand what you're doing. It's no longer a stressful guessing game, but a purposeful conversation with the plant. You're looking at its structure, assessing its growth from the previous season, making decisions that will shape its productivity for the coming year. I've come to really enjoy my late winter pruning sessions, bundled up against the cold, moving methodically through each vine. There's satisfaction in making a clean cut, in seeing the pile of removed canes grow, knowing that what remains is strong and purposeful. It's one of those gardening tasks that rewards knowledge and attention, where you can see the direct results of your decisions playing out over the following months. My neighbour Lucas, who's in his 70s and has been gardening his whole life, once told me that grapevines taught him patience and the value of delayed gratification. He planted his first vines as a young man, made plenty of mistakes, had years of poor harvests, but kept at it, learning and adjusting. Now his property has mature vines that produce abundantly with what seems like minimal effort, though of course that ease comes from decades of accumulated knowledge. He prunes confidently, quickly, barely seeming to think about it, but every cut is purposeful. When I asked him what his biggest piece of advice would be for someone starting out, he said to not be afraid of cutting. Most people prune too timidly, he explained, leaving too much wood because they're worried about harming the plant. But grapevines are vigorous and forgiving. Even if you make mistakes, they'll usually recover and give you another chance. The worst thing you can do is prune too lightly and end up with a tangled, unproductive mess. Record keeping might sound tedious, but it's incredibly useful for grape growing. I keep a simple notebook where I jot down when I pruned each vine, how many canes I kept, which varieties performed best, when I saw first bloom, when I harvested, and any problems I encountered. Over the years, this has become an invaluable reference. I can look back and see patterns like which varieties need more aggressive pruning or which parts of my yard produce the best grapes. I can also track my own learning curve, seeing how my techniques have evolved and improved. There's something satisfying about flipping through those pages and seeing the progression from confused beginner notes to confident, detailed observations. The sensory experience of a well-maintained vineyard, even a small backyard one, is something special. The way the leaves rustle in the breeze, the sweet smell of ripening grapes in late summer, the feeling of cutting a perfect cluster and feeling its weight in your hand, these are rewards that go beyond just the harvest itself. There's beauty in the architecture of the vines, the way they drape over an arbor or march along a fence line. Proper pruning enhances this beauty, creating clean lines and balanced growth rather than chaotic tangles. When visitors come to my garden, the grapevines always draw attention and questions. People are fascinated by them, maybe because they seem exotic or complicated. But once I explain the basics, most realize they could grow grapes successfully too. Let's circle back to that one critical cut, because I want to make absolutely sure this is clear. When you stand in front of your grapevine with your pruners in hand, you're looking for canes that are 1 year old, healthy, vigorous, with good bud spacing. You're selecting 4 to 6 of these depending on your vine's size and vigor. Everything else gets cut away. Old canes, weak canes, damaged canes, extra 1 year old canes beyond your chosen few, all of it comes off. You're also leaving a couple of renewal spurs cut back to 2 or 3 buds near the base of each fruiting cane. These spurs are your investment in next year. The canes you keep get tied to your support structure, spaced out so new growth won't crowd. That's it. That's the system. Simple in concept, but it requires you to actually look at the vine, understand what you're seeing, and make thoughtful decisions. Different climates and growing conditions might require some adjustment to timing or technique, but the core principles remain universal. In colder climates, you might need to protect your vines in winter or delay pruning slightly to avoid the coldest periods. In very hot climates, you might need to leave a bit more canopy to protect the fruit from sunburn, but you're still working with the same basic framework of selecting the right canes and removing the rest. I've talked with grape growers from all over, from cold northern regions to hot southern areas, and while their specific challenges vary, the pruning approach is remarkably consistent. It's a testament to how well this method works when properly applied. The economic aspect shouldn't be overlooked either. If you're growing grapes for personal consumption, proper pruning means you'll get enough fruit to actually preserve, make jam, make wine, or share with friends and family. If you're growing for market or as a small business, the difference between mediocre yields and abundant ones directly impacts your bottom line. Even if profit isn't your goal, there's value in not wasting space, time, and effort on plants that underperform. A well-pruned grapevine takes up the same amount of space as a poorly pruned one, but the return on investment is vastly different. I've also found that success with grapevines builds confidence for tackling other challenging plants. Once you master the art of thinking about plant growth in terms of wood age, fruiting habits, and strategic pruning, you can apply similar principles to other fruiting plants. Stone fruits, berries, even some ornamentals benefit from understanding which wood produces what and how to encourage productive growth over vegetative sprawl. Grapes are an excellent teacher plant in that regard. They're forgiving enough to survive mistakes, responsive enough that you see results quickly, and productive enough that success is genuinely rewarding. Community knowledge is another valuable resource. Joining a local gardening club, connecting with other grape growers in your area, or participating in online forums can accelerate your learning curve dramatically. People share their successes and failures, ask questions, offer advice based on local conditions, and generally create a supportive environment for learning. I've picked up countless tips from other growers, things that aren't in books or videos but come from years of hands-on experience. Likewise, I've been able to help newer growers avoid the mistakes I made early on. There's a generous spirit in the gardening community, a willingness to share knowledge because we all understand the joy that comes from growing things successfully. As we head toward wrapping up this conversation, I want to emphasize that while I've given you a lot of information, don't let it overwhelm you. Start with the basics. Identify 1-year-old canes. Keep 4 to 6 good ones. Remove everything else. Add some renewal spurs and tie the keepers to your support. Do that and you'll be ahead of probably 80% of backyard grape growers. As you gain experience, you'll refine your technique, develop an eye for the subtle differences between canes, learn the quirks of your specific varieties, and build that intuitive understanding that makes the whole process feel natural. But you have to start somewhere, and starting with a solid understanding of that one critical cut is the perfect foundation. Your grapevines are waiting for you to unlock their potential. They want to produce abundantly. They're biologically programmed to grow vigorously and fruit heavily. The only thing standing between you and gorgeous harvests is understanding how to work with the plant's natural growth patterns rather than against them. That one cut, that decision to keep the right canes and remove everything else, is the key that unlocks everything. It's not complicated once you understand it, but it is specific and requires you to actually look at what you're pruning rather than just hacking away randomly. I hope this conversation has given you clarity and confidence. I hope you're excited to get out there with your pruners and transform your grapevines. I hope next summer finds you standing in your garden, looking at vines heavy with beautiful grape clusters, knowing that your pruning made that happen. And I hope you'll come back and share your results, your questions, and your own discoveries. Gardening is a continuous learning process, and we're all in it together, figuring things out, celebrating successes, and learning from setbacks. Your grapevines are going to thrive, I'm certain of it, because now you know what they need. Go make it happen and enjoy every step of the journey from dormant winter canes to abundant summer harvest. Happy growing, friends, and I'll see you in the next one here at Botanic Haven.